am thrilled to be here, just because what you all are doing in practice, focusing on details, is a spiritual truth of our country.
You know, we can be Democrats and Republicans, but most Americans are patriots.
For over a decade now, good ideas have emanated from the BPC.
Thank you for convening this very impressive group of thought leaders.
Your organization has brought together leaders from across our society to advocate for common sense solutions to our most challenging problems.
Because if it's bipartisan, it's much more likely to pass.
When you have people philosophically and ideologically in two different worlds, and they put them together on a committee, that committee usually is not very productive. Once we get staffs blending, and John and I, they know that the members are friends and we talk, things can happen.
Thank you, Anand, for that introduction, and to the BPC for its important efforts.
Thank the Bipartisan Policy Center. You guys are great.
We all have bipartisan responsibilities to this nation to defend principles that have long made America the beacon of hope.
It's going to take all of us to try to turn down the temperature and really focus on what unites us.
Good morning, and thank you all for joining us for the third in our series exploring what to expect when the Republicans, I am thrilled to be joined today by Doug Holtz-Eakin, who, before he founded the American Action Forum in 2009, served in a variety of influential policy positions, including the chief economist of the President's Council of Economic Advisors and the sixth director of the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. Obviously, the economy is the topic of the day, and so who better to speak with than an economist of his amazing credentials. Before we dive into it, I just want to tell everyone who's watching us online that you can enter questions into the chat on YouTube or Facebook, or on Twitter at #BPCLive. Doug, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, thank you, and my congratulations to BPC for this series.
Thank you. So before we dive into the work, you founded the American Action Forum. Can you talk a little bit about why and what y'all are focused on over there?
Yeah, AAF came out of my different experiences in Washington. As you mentioned, I've been very fortunate to have some time at the White House, Council of Economic Advisors, ran the Congressional Budget Office. I was the Director of Domestic and Economic Policy on the John McCain presidential campaign. And it finally dawned on me that in those jobs, you did policy research, policy options, advice, education, but you did it in a very particular way, which is, number one, you worked on the issue of the day. You did not have the luxury of saying to your boss, you know, I do turtle migration. When that comes up, let me know. You know, I'm not really interested in this inflation thing. So that's not an option. You work on whatever's happening. And then you had to convey whatever your research findings were in English to non-specialists. So there was a very high premium on the communication function and the public education aspect of it. And in all of those jobs, you had to be cognizant of the political lay of the land. At the White House, it's all about the president's agenda, regardless of who's controlling Congress. It's about the president's agenda. Obviously, at the CBO, it is by statute nonpartisan, so you have to be very careful to make sure you don't have anything like that in there. And a campaign is a reasonably political event. And so, you know, there it's, can you make good policy, good politics? And so I sort of, at the end of the campaign, I thought about, you know, what am I going to do next? And I realized that it probably wasn't just my political bosses who were interested in that kind of information, that there might be an appetite out there for people who don't spend their time reading white papers to, you know, an oil rig blows up in the Gulf of Mexico, ask the question, okay, well, you know, what are the options that we have here? And I'm a market-oriented guy. What do we want to think about doing? And so the AAF is really dedicated to that. We're a center-right organization, but we're honest about our leanings. We like market-oriented solutions to policy problems. And we're going to try to cover the waterfront of domestic and economic policy issues. We don't do any social issues. We're not staffed up to do international affairs and things like that. But on domestic and economic policy issues, we're going to try to weigh in on whatever is going on, typically in the Congress. That was my orientation at the outset. But increasingly, the agencies and the regulatory activity is where policy is being made. And so we've migrated to cover that as well. And so the mission really is to get up every day, look at your policy area, and ask, what do people need to know about what's going on? And try to convey that in a way that is digestible and understandable to non-specialists. And it's been an enormous amount of fun. I have to be honest. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Well, that's great. And you definitely are the right person we want to talk to today. I will say, I just discovered your daily dishes. I was preparing for today's interview, and I commend it to folks who are just want a kind of a quick hit on economic policy. It was interesting to read.
Well, thank you. As I told you before we started this meeting, and I'll warn the viewers, the economic section of our daily email is really my personal therapy, and so whatever angst I may have often shows up in there, and then my mother calls me and tells me to tone it down. So we're working on that.
Well, there's certainly a lot to be nervous about these days, and of course, you know, we have an election coming up. That is the premise before our event series, and the issue is the economy. As James Carville famously said once, it's the economy, stupid. It is the issue of the day. You've got inflation, you have a threat of recession. As you know, there were some positive signs, positive announcements yesterday, but we still have very high inflation, record high, in fact. So before we get into the politics of all this and how it's going to influence November, what is your opinion on the state of the economy? And perhaps more importantly for this political conversation, what is going to be the status of inflation and recession 3 months from now? Is it still going to be a factor?
So let's just start with the news of the day. There was a lot of excitement about the consumer price index data that was released yesterday because it showed the top line CPI inflation flat during the month of July. I'm an economist. I live to provide a dark cloud for every silver lining, and so I'm just here to say that report, I think, if looked at carefully, showed no real signs of progress. We knew gasoline prices were down and down sharply, and that drove the top line. If you go past that, there's nothing but more of the same. Core inflation, non-food, non-energy inflation was year over year at 5.9%, as it was the month before. And that food, energy, and shelter about half of a typical family's budget. And so I spent a lot of time looking at the shelter component. It's a third of the CPI by itself. And shelter inflation was up yet again. It has been rising continuously since January of 2021. It's now at 5.7% year over year. And you can't get to a 2% target with shelter inflation at 6%. Everything else has to be zero. And so the Fed is going to have to do the kinds of things that bring down shelter inflation and other kinds of services, because that's where the inflation is right now. And those aren't like gasoline. They're not volatile. They don't go up and down easily. You have to lean hard and continuously. And so we're going to see more of the same for months now. And one of those months is going to be November, when the election takes place. And that will come on the heels of the Fed having raised rates pretty aggressively to try to get inflation back under control. And I think that's the future.
So how much is history working against President Biden and the Democrats? Has there ever been a point in US history where a sitting US president during a recession and such high inflation numbers hasn't lost control of either chamber?
So I'm going to dodge the question for a second and simply go back to the recession issue. I don't think we are in a recession. I just want to be clear about that. A recession is a sustained, broad decline in economic activity. We don't have the breadth of decline that I think qualifies as a recession. It's hard to imagine a recession with the labor market adding, 500,000 jobs in a month. That doesn't feel like a recession. And so we have some signs of problems. There's no question about it. The Fed has been quite honest about the fact that raising rates as it must to deal with inflation could in fact produce a recession. They'd prefer not. They'd like to get a soft landing, but history's against them. The odds of pulling that off are low. So we may enter a recession late this year, early next year. I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation, but the doom and gloom right now in the moment, I think, is overstated. But to your point, midterms are typically bad for sitting presidents. The opposition typically takes over. You get big changes in control. Most people, when you look at the polling, name the economy, inflation is the number one issue. So the environment is not good for this president. And the second issue is crime. And there's very little that a president can do about that on the ground. And so that's a bad issue set in a time when typically the president's going to take a hit. So it's not particularly promising for President Biden.
So we got 3 months before the election. Congress will adjourn shortly. There's not a whole lot that can be done from a policy perspective between now and then. The Democrats did just pass the Inflation Reduction Act, which I believe the House will do this week and get signed into law. And so is that going to curb inflation? Is there anything? The Fed's obviously very active, but really for Democrats who are facing the ballot box in November, is there anything they can do between now and then?
So the theory of the case is that if you want to use fiscal policy, taxes and spending to help control inflation, you want to raise taxes or cut spending or in some way reduce budget deficits. And that's what they advertise the Inflation Reduction Act is doing, reducing deficits by $300 billion over the next 10 years. The problem with that argument is that that means it's about $30 billion a year in a $21 trillion economy. That's not a big enough lever to move inflation at all. It's very tiny. Second problem is that all of that deficit reduction really comes in the last 5 years. And so we have 5 years of modestly larger deficits at the front end, and those would add to inflation. And, if we don't have inflation back closer to 2% after 5 years, then everyone will understand why I always carry cash in my passport, because it's going to be bad. This is a non issue with respect to inflation. The Inflation Reduction Act is really about the policy pieces underneath, the tax policy, the health policy, the climate policy. It's not about inflation. The other thing I would just remind everyone is that in the end, inflation and the contribution of a Congress to inflation or combating inflation comes from the cumulative impact of all of its actions. And while we have been talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, Congress has passed the CHIPS and Science Act, which is $300 billion of deficit finance spending. So that there goes the deficit reduction in the IRA. And they also passed the PACT Act, which has up to $600 billion of deficit finance spending. So, business as usual for the Congress. Spend $1 trillion, talk about paying for it later.
So if inflation is still an issue with us, and it likely will be into next year, and Republicans do take the House, personally, I'm a little skeptical about the Senate, but let's assume it's just the House. You still have divided government. You still have a Democrat in the White House and presumably in the Senate. But even if we take the Senate, it's still divided government. So what do Republicans do? Is there a middle ground here for them to work with the president on economic policy that might address inflation? Or do we expect obviously they largely oppose a lot of those initiatives you just mentioned. There was bipartisan support for the CHIPS Act. So I know they've advocated that we are putting too much money into the economy. You're not going to be able to roll any of that back when they take over.
So the uncomfortable truth is that once you let inflation get ingrained, you have no real good choices. One choice is live with the inflation. We've seen how palatable that is. That's not a real option. The other choice is do the kinds of things the Federal Reserve is doing, which is to raise interest rates and make it harder to buy cars and houses and all credit financed activities. Quote, shrink its portfolio, which is just a fancy way of saying pull money out of the financial system to reduce the liquidity and tighten financial conditions. That's pretty much a bad news scenario. And when you're the person who is no longer buying a house, can't get a new car, you're a home builder and there's no demand for your products. That's not very attractive. And what can Congress do? It can raise taxes or cut spending, neither of which is a whole lot of fun. And so the notion that there will be some great thing that they can agree on to fight inflation, I think is overstated from the outset. No one likes the things you have to do to fight inflation. So probably the best thing that Congress could do is think about how can we make sure we don't get in this position again? Let's not do the things that put us in a position to sort of push inflation. Part of that was excessive fiscal stimulus in the American Rescue Plan, $2 trillion at a time when the economy was already growing at 6.5%. It was just a big policy error. I don't see a divided Congress making that kind of a mistake. I think Republicans genuinely would check that. So that's one thing they will do, addition by subtraction, don't make a mistake. The second thing they can do, and this will be tougher, is they can have some sort of honest conversation about the climate strategy and how we could adapt the strategy to recognize that in most economic analyses of climate policy, natural gas in particular is the bridge fuel, and that when you have a strategy that allows for fossil fuels to survive as the bridge to a cleaner future, we wouldn't be in the same position where this time when we got all these global shocks to oil and gas markets. And so that's a place where one would hope they could come to some agreement with their colleagues in the Congress and with the administration's regulatory approaches, because that really did a climate strategy that was really predicated on taking fossil fuels out of the equation quickly, was unrealistically quick, and exposed the U.S. when the Ukraine invasion happened.
Great. So you have also mentioned a couple times now housing, and we know that there is a serious shortage of affordable housing, not to mention the rising cost of mortgages. And so you had spoken last month at a housing summit we had done. It is a huge driver right now of the economy. It is, as you mentioned before, a third of the CPI. What do you expect Republicans could do about housing? There is some bipartisanship around things like the low-income housing tax credit, but is there much? What do you think the Republicans might try and do, if anything, if they retake the House?
So let me just back up a little bit and sort of set the stage for this, because this is going to be a very hard problem. When the pandemic hit, the Fed began cutting rates to zero immediately, and it also started buying $120 billion a month of treasuries, 90 billion, and mortgage-backed securities, 30 billion. And each time it bought that, it essentially printed $120 billion and pushed it into the economy. So it flooded financial markets with dollars, about 5 trillion total during that entire period. And a lot of that was flooding into the mortgage market. So it was a real stimulus of the housing sector as part of the Fed's actions. It is now going to reverse course on both fronts. So that means that the extra help that the housing market got in the stimulus is going to be extra pressure that comes from tightening. There's going to be tightening from just higher rates. We've already seen mortgage rates go up. We've seen the refinancing market essentially disappear very quickly. But at the same time, it's also now pulling $35 billion a month out of the mortgage finance capital market. And that tightens things even further. So housing is going to get extra pressure from the Fed as just a mechanical result of reversing their policy. Now that's actually how the Fed typically helps cool the economy, because if you can't get a mortgage to buy a house, you don't buy a house. And if people aren't buying houses, no one builds a house. And if you don't build houses, you don't put furnaces in them, you don't put ovens in them, you don't do all of the things that really feed back into the economy. And so in the process, the Fed cools a lot of the economy by slowing the housing market. And we can expect that to happen. The trouble is, in this housing market, we already had record low inventory, few vacancies, rents and homeowner costs are quite high. And we're saying, let's do less supply of housing. So now what are you going to do? You might like to sort of, have a big building boom somehow, so you get a lot more houses for people, particularly low income affordable houses. But the Fed's trying to stop that. And so if you undertake a fiscal policy to do that, you subsidize home building somehow, the Fed's going to turn right around and lean harder, because it's got to stop the shelter inflation that's a core part of their problem. So there's a real difficult problem. I don't want to minimize it about what you can do. I think targeted solutions for populations that don't involve big aggregate demand pushes that are going to make the Fed twitchy. I mean, that's the solution, and that's going to require some real hard work and thoughtful policy design.
But so much of the housing issue is really driven at the state and local government through, particularly the local level of the zoning laws. Is there really, what are some of the trigger points that things that Congress might be able to do?
So my list of things that Congress might also persuade the administration to is, let's make the building of homes cheaper. Okay, so let's drop all of the tariffs on softwood lumber, steel and aluminum, inputs to building houses, make them cheaper in any way you can. Low-income housing tax credits are an attempt to subsidize that. Those are things that the Congress can do. And they're also trying, and the administration is trying to influence state and local decision makers to, change in particular land use laws and excessive zoning restrictions that inhibit the supply of housing from growing. That combination is about all that you can really do if you want to focus on getting more housing built.
So you mentioned trade. Obviously, Congress just passed the CHIPS Act with the president's support, which was aimed at addressing the supply chain issues around semiconductors. It started as a much bigger proposal, and it kind of got narrowed down into some science investments and the semiconductor industry. But there's still a lot of concern about supply chain, particularly how workforce shortages are impacting the ports, et cetera. There was some bipartisanship around the CHIPS Act. What do you see supply chain issues continuing to be a struggle going into the next year? And what does Congress just check the box and say, okay, we've addressed that, we're done?
I'm a little perplexed by the obsession of policymakers with supply chains. I mean, policymakers don't have any supply chains. Businesses have supply chains. And so if I'm a semiconductor manufacturer and my only source is in Taiwan, and I now view Taiwan as a very risky location, the obvious business incentive is to diversify and build fabs somewhere else, whether it be Europe or the US or Japan. And so there's a real private business incentive to always solve these supply chain problems. It's not something that policymakers need to jump into. You will make more money if you can get your products to your customers on time and cheaper, and they have every incentive to do that. They've learned some lessons about excessive concentrations and what can happen when there's a global pandemic and transportation networks are disrupted. But I don't think there's as much of a policy issue there as the policymakers seem to think. And for that reason, the number one reason we've had supply chain disruptions is that people have had COVID-19. The number one priority going forward continues to be the global public health mission of combating the virus to the extent possible. That'll clean that's the government's appropriate role in cleaning up that constraint on the economy. So I hope that one of the things that Republicans and Democrats can do in the next Congress is continue to stay ahead of any residual waves of the pandemic, mutations and variants that would threaten the ability of the economy to weather this. It's still taking a bigger toll, I think, than people realize. At this point, the variants don't seem as deadly, fewer hospitalizations, not as many headlines, but there's still a lot of people out of work on a fairly regular basis, and it's a lot of disruption in the workplace, and we're seeing it. We're having trouble with productivity growth, and we need to keep our eye on the ball with regard to the public health mission. I hope that's one of the things that they do.
Yeah, it's you see it everywhere now. We've certainly seen it here at BPC, and every day there's somebody else out with COVID. The implications to the economy are still very much there. Since we were talking a little bit about trade and supply chains, so we've seen the populist wing of the Republican Party, I think largely thanks to President Trump, have really taken hold and are growing. We see a lot of that reflected in the Senate, although I think the Senate is still largely reflective of more of the establishment wing. But the populists are gaining ground, and I think it is called into question where the party stands on trade and business. Republicans were known my entire life as the party of big business. I don't know that that's true anymore. Free trade is not quite viewed the same way it had been. So what are your thoughts on where the Republicans might be next year on trade agreements? And there's a big push on ESG, and Europe is doing a lot with regard to American corporations. Where are Republicans going to be on all that? It's a lot to unpack in one question. Sorry.
Okay, thank you for a very hard question. I think first of all, I think your diagnosis is right. I mean, the party is divided and doesn't have a unified philosophy that guides it going forward, and so you can anticipate some back and forth on that front within the party and across the parties, and I don't expect it to be especially clean in terms of its philosophy and the design of policies. But I think the important thing to recognize is that the populists have a point if they believe the party is the party of big business, because from the economic point of view, you don't want to be for big business. You want to be for the voter. You want to be for the customer, for the household, and the businesses are a conduit for delivering the things that generate a greater standard of living, more prosperity, and better opportunities for everybody. And if you're only paying attention to the business, you are making a mistake. So from a market-oriented economics perspective, populism is a good thing if it means, hey, let's pay attention to the consumer. Let's let the consumer run the show. That's who we care about. When it turns into, we don't care about the consumer, we just want to beat up this business for the sheer joy of beating up this big business, that's, I think, where it gets off track. And so we've seen some places where I think we might see something on that front. There has been a fair amount of appetite for new approaches to competition policy, antitrust, merger review, that move away from the traditional approach, which I'll call the consumer welfare standard, where you evaluate a merger, for example, and whether it lowers prices for consumers and whether it's good for them, to other things like this business is too big, or the industry is too concentrated, or things along those lines. I'm not a big fan of those approaches, but there is support for some of that in the Republican Party. There's some in the Democratic Party. That's one I'd keep an eye on as something that going forward, there may be some action on. The other place I'd expect some real effort is on financial regulation, and some of that will be disagreements. And I think the role of financial markets in climate policy, ESG, disclosures, the kinds of things the SEC is looking at right now will be I think a flashpoint between the parties, and things like, what are we going to do to regulate crypto will be a point of agreement. They both have an interest in finding out a way to make sure that the world is safe for cryptocurrencies. And I think that'll be a place where they can cooperate.
Great. So I just a reminder to the audience, please put your questions in the chat or use hashtag BPC Live on Twitter. And I've got one more for Doug, and then I'll turn to the audience questions. So what do you think the Republicans will do when they first take office? And how is that different from what you would like to see them do?
Well, I think, most parties, when they retake control, the first vote is to make a point. Like, we're in charge now, and this is what's different. The biggest difference between the parties right now, and with the top issue being inflation, is the role of fossil fuels and energy prices. And so I would fully expect the first bill to be a quote message bill, one that's not ever expected to be enacted because the president's not going to sign it, but a message bill on energy policy, like, a more aggressive use of fossil fuels, especially in the near term, to deal with the prices that we've seen. So that's the first one. Since it's not going anywhere, you question, what would you do instead that might actually get signed by the president? And there, I think you have to go to some of these other issues. The ones that I would love to see them do, but I don't think there's a great appetite yet, is, well, let's look forward and see that there's problems with Social Security. In 10 years, we're going to see the trust fund go bankrupt. There's problems with Medicare, hospital trust funds in trouble. Let's take the social safety net and make it financially durable, and make the point that we disagree with you, the Democrats, on a lot of things, including massive expansions of a social safety net when the existing one's not safe. And let's take care of the existing one, make seniors secure in their future. I'd love to see that, because that's where the federal budget problems largely reside.
Great. And have you seen any bipartisan glimmers on entitlement reform?
No, but I think it's pretty simple. Entitlement reform is something that you really do because you're worried about the durability of the programs, as I am, and because you're worried about the budget as a whole. And there's zero appetite for worrying about the federal budget right now, and I think that's understandable. If you look at the 21st century, we've only seen the debt go up, especially relative to GDP. It's never stabilized. It's only gone up. And the reason, I think, is my old boss, George W. Bush, said that the primary goal is to win the global war against terror. And ignore the budget, right? And President Obama basically sent the message that for 8 years that there's nothing wrong with the federal budget that can't be fixed by having the rich pay their fair share. Didn't mention anything else. President Trump didn't mention the budget for 4 years. And so for 20 years, the American public has not been told by the most important person, the president, that the federal budget is an issue, and that if you want to deal with this important issue, you have to deal with the entitlement program. So let's get to work. Until that public education happens, no member of Congress is going to take it up and go off and try to do something, because there's simply no support out there for it. So I think it's urgent, but the education has to precede the action, and hopefully that will happen in this next Congress.
Let's hope so. So I'm going to turn to some of our audience questions. Let's see. If there's a Republican House and a Democratic Senate, do you think they will work together to expand the child tax credit in a bipartisan way, perhaps working from Romney's FSA?
I think there's a good chance of that. And here's the reason why. Among the top things on Republicans' lists will be, let's make permanent the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions that are going to expire in the years to come. Let's do that as soon as possible, because a permanent, reliable tax code is part of a better business environment that can improve the performance of the economy. It's also a key aspect of increasing the supply side of the economy and thus reducing future inflationary pressures. And so that's going to be way up on the list. To do it, they're going to have to get 60 votes in the Senate, so they're going to have to do some things that Democrats care about, and that child credit is going to be way up on their list. So that's a natural place for an agreement on how are we going to tax pass-throughs. Republicans care about that. How are we going to deal with the child credit? Democrats care about that. Let's find the sweet spot on those issues. And so that seems quite plausible to me.
So we got a couple more here. So since COVID, are the old economic ideas in monetary and fiscal policy passé? How would you suggest to solve the problem of the vast income inequality? And I'm going to add a little bit to that. Really speaking more about what is economic inequality. It means different things to different people. Is it wealth inequality? Is it inequality of opportunity, lack of mobility? How do conservatives view those issues? And then if you could speak a little bit broader to the question about broader economic policy.
So let me do the second first, because I think there's been a real misunderstanding of the recent recession. If you look at the 20th century, when I was trained as an economist, recessions were income events. Factories slowed down, the goods started piling up on the shelves, and so they laid some people off, didn't produce as much. They didn't have any income, they didn't spend it. And you got this sort of downward cycle. Eventually the shelves are bare, they have to restart the faculty, they bring the guys back, they get paid, they spend more, and you get the virtuous cycle up. But it's income flows that drove 20th century recessions, and most of our tools of economic policy came from that experience. Unemployment insurance to partially replace that income, keep the standard of living from falling, allow them to keep spending, discretionary tax cuts, discretionary public works projects to produce work and give people incomes. Without telling us, the economy changed its tune in the 21st century. We have had two recessions that were driven by financial market events. We had the dot-com bubble burst, and we had a 2001, 2002 mild recession, from the recovery from which was not great. It was called the jobless recovery. I was at the White House and CBO at the time. There's an enormous amount of pressure on policymakers to make this work better, and they kept using the old tools, and it didn't work very well. Then we had the financial crisis and Great Recession, and a sort of debt bubble that burst and dragged down the Main Street economy. And if you'll recall, we tried the same things, recovery acts, and we had a recovery that was very dissatisfying. And so we sort of came into this period with sort of some misgivings about how to deal with downturns. And this downturn is completely different than anything we've seen. This is a recession. In 2020, we actually saw private incomes rise. We saw wealth rise. If you think back to the stock market boom, housing boom, all of that. So this was nothing like either the 20th century or the 21st century recessions. It was, we can't go out and spend our money. And what we saw was this decline in household consumption, and it was uniquely focused on high income Americans. If you looked at the data by the end of 2020, spending in low and middle income zip codes was back to where it had been in February of 2020. It was in affluent areas where spending was still down because people weren't going to shows, they weren't taking vacations, they weren't doing the kinds of nights out at restaurants and things. And so the tools we had, sending out checks to relatively low income individuals, weren't going to fix that. The only thing that was going to fix that was making the world safe from the coronavirus. And so I don't think it's true that the old tools of monetary policy and fiscal policy remain ineffective against traditional recessions, income events. I think they'll work just fine. We know that. I think we have some concerns about how effective they are against financial market events. And so trying to avoid these big financial crises is an important thing. And they don't do any good really against a consumption-driven decline because of the pandemic. The solution to that is the public health mission. So make it safe to operate the economy in the face of the virus. So I guess my basic wish is that for people before they launch into let's stimulate the economy, let's first ask the question of why is it down? And I don't think we're very careful about asking that question. Then that did reveal, however, a large amount of inequality. There's no question about that. And so there is this issue of how you generally think about the inequality question. So if you look back to the late 80s, 90s, we had this phenomenon in the labor market where, adjusted for inflation, incomes at the bottom end were falling some, labor incomes, and incomes at the top end were going up. And so we had this widening of the labor income distribution. Late in the 90s and in the 2000s, the bottom stopped dropping, but the top kept going up, and it continues to go up. And so we've had this real widening of labor income inequality for sure. And the question is, how do you think about that? Is it a bad thing for there to be more rich people? And so many conservatives would say, okay, I'm not worried about that fact that people are getting rich. That's fine. That's a good thing in America. We should be worried about the bottom end and whether it's adequate. Is that standard of living something we can be proud of as Americans? And that puts the focus more on poverty, more on economic self-sufficiency than on inequality per se. Some people are quite uncomfortable with the simultaneous, coexistence of super affluent people and less affluent people, and they want the gap to be tighter. And I understand their desire, but the problem with that from an economic policy point of view is you have to tell me what the right gap is, like how much inequality is okay. Is it literally zero, in which case, regardless of your effort, everyone gets the same thing? Or so what types of inequalities are acceptable, and how big are the ones that we're going to live with? And so far, there's no real good answer to those questions. It makes it hard to design policy to fight inequality because you don't know exactly what you're trying to accomplish. You have to have a goal, or you can't design a policy effectively.
So one of the challenges we talked to with our previous two speakers, Tim Carney and Yuval Levin, was if you're looking at issues related to poverty, Republicans generally do not support aggressive federal policies in economic areas. And so if you are Kevin McCarthy, Mitch McConnell, you're looking to retake Congress, and we know that there is this issue of folks who are at poverty level, struggling to get out. How do they articulate an economic policy to help them? What are some of the policies that they might be able to get behind?
So it's important how you frame the question. If you frame it as we're worried about poverty, and poverty is the absence of material wealth and the ability to maintain your standard of living, then the solution to poverty is money, and then you can do transfer programs and you set it up to support things like that. If you frame the question as we would like people to be economically self-sufficient, that they can go get a job and support themselves in a way that we think is acceptable in America, you have a very different framing, because then you have, number one, a focus on the individual and making sure they are capable of doing their part of that bargain. That leads straight down to better performance in our education system. And I'll just worry out loud for 5 seconds about that, because we had a K-12 education system that was a real national disaster going into the pandemic, and it's only gotten worse. So I think that's a place where we have to go back and start thinking hard again to make sure that we actually educate our next generations in a way that they can go out and get jobs and support themselves. And I don't think we're doing that. It also means a richer array of opportunities, apprenticeships, and vocational education, and things that aren't just liberal arts education in college. So that's a set of things I think are very, very important right now. Then there's the employer side of it. How do we make sure that jobs have high productivity and continue to have real wage growth, and provide an environment for, if you go to work, you actually get the ability to support yourself. Those are in the wheelhouse of Republicans who are interested in economic policy. And so I would think they'd have a lot to talk about if they frame it that way.
Great. So one other question we have, which I think is kind of interesting. So I guess you used the word cheaper. I don't quite recall the context, but well, Americans are obsessed with cheap consumer goods. You see it, that it drives a lot of today's business, actually. So other than in the food space. So is that part of our problem? Or is it more the loss of jobs in manufacturing? So we're getting cheap goods from overseas, but we really need to be making them more here.
I'm not a big fan of that argument. If you look over the large swath of American history, what we really have seen is a migration of workers from the agricultural sector into the service sector, and manufacturing's been there all along. There was a decline in manufacturing employment for a while because it was the most productive part of the economy. The share of our economy that was manufactured output was roughly the same, and we were doing it with fewer workers, and we usually think that's a good thing, that you can be more productive. And the issue becomes then, what is the productivity of these service sector jobs? And that's a hard economic question, because think of healthcare. Healthcare is a big part of our economy, a lot of employment in healthcare. What's the productivity of healthcare? What's the output? And, so you get into a little bit of a statistical morass, but I don't think there was this overwhelming problem that came from the US labor market adapting to the 21st century as opposed to the 19th century. I think that was by and large successful. To the extent that we had a problem, it really was the entry of China into the global trading system, which India plus China, that shock to provide so much low-skilled labor into the world market really did reduce the return to labor across the globe. And we saw the same pressures in every country. That shock's largely been weathered. And so to always look back at that to design policy now, I think is a mistake. What do we need now to make sure that our workers are providing the things that our consumers want and doing things which are most productive for them, and then import the others? That's the basic recipe in economics always. And so the first part of that is what we just talked about. Let's make sure they're educated, make sure our firms are in a productive and growing environment, and don't view imports as a failure. View them as the natural part of doing the things you're best at and letting other people do the less skilled things.
So I've got one final question coming from the audience, and I think it's because healthcare costs are obviously a huge driver of the economy, the one that we haven't really touched on very much today. The United States spends billions of dollars on healthcare. Good results, but perhaps not as good as some other countries are getting. And so Republicans, for years it was repeal the ACA, didn't really have a policy to replace it with. Do you think Republicans might take a stab at healthcare? And if so, what might it be?
So it will not be repeal and replace, which was never a sensible framing of it, because they had no desire to replace it with something even close to comparable. They were opposed to that approach to covering people. So to the extent that they're going to do healthcare, I think they'll do it in a Republican fashion, which is not some one size fits all top down dramatic reform of a system. It'll be, let's solve some problems. Right? We have some problems in the delivery of rural health. So what can we do to get healthcare out there in more rural parts of the country? We have an embarrassment on maternal mortality, recognized on both sides of the aisle. This administration's already started to do some things that we can do more there. Let's sort of think about that. So I expect initiatives of that type, where we take on some specific problems and they get solved in a way that's best for that geography and for that population, not what looks best from an office in HHS.
Well, and that seems like an area that you could get President Biden to
Yeah.
engage with, particularly rural health and maternal health care. Those are certainly areas there could be bipartisan agreement on.
I completely agree. I think those are good places to think about doing some work.
Great. Well, on that very positive note, we're going to draw today's event to a close. Doug, thank you so much for spending time with us this morning. Your insights were very helpful. I'm sure the audience agrees. And thank you all for following us. We're going to have one more in the series later on this year, so keep an eye on our website. And of course, you can also follow Doug at AmericanActionForum.org. I get that right?
That's right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Take care.